Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. This is the very beginning of our first unit on organic chemistry. Organic chemistry is a really, really important branch of chemistry because really it ties into the chemistry that describes, among other things, life. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk specifically about the simplest chemicals, organic chemicals, which are hydrocarbons, and a simple kind of hydrocarbon called an alkane. And so when we talk about organic chemistry, in fact, when we talk about any hydrocarbon, it really has carbon at its center. So carbon has been described as the atom of life because as far as we know, organic structures are always built around this carbon atom. And the reason is because carbon has a really specific configuration with its electrons. So if you picture a carbon atom as a Bohr diagram, you know that carbon has 6 electrons, so that's the Bohr diagram it takes. If I draw that as a Lewis structure, and that is sort of a simplification of our Bohr diagram, which is to talk only about the valence electrons, then I could draw my carbon atom like this, where I've got a carbon atom and it's got 4 valence electrons. And so those 4 valence electrons are really the key to the flexibility of carbon as an atom, and so to make these really complex molecules. Because it has 4 valence electrons, and you remember that in a covalent compound, each bond is going to require 1 electron from one atom and another electron from a second atom, and the sharing of those electrons will create the bond. That means that carbon can create 4 bonds, which is about as good as we can do. So an organic compound, broadly speaking, is any compound that contains carbon. That's as simple as it gets. And there are some examples where that's maybe debatable, but for our purposes, we'll just think of anything with carbon in it as being organic. It usually has carbon and hydrogen. And so we might call that a hydrocarbon because it has hydrogen and carbon in it. So organic compounds could contain any number of other things, but really typical things for them to contain are oxygen as well as nitrogen. Some others contain sulfur or perhaps halides like chlorine or bromine. And so these other things can come in there and they have really specific functions, but at the heart of it, it's all about carbon and hydrogen. So if we look at this here, we've got some pictures here, and you might be used to seeing these kinds of structures drawn for chemicals, and they look pretty complex, but at their heart, they all follow a really simple set of rules, which are going to allow us to predict how they're going to react and tell us how what their structure is going to look like and what their function might be. And so just when you look at these scan across, these are actually some really familiar molecules. Like you know what a lot of these things are, even if you can't recognize them when you first glance at them. For example, this first thing right here is acetic acid. And acetic acid you might know from its other name of vinegar. So it's the component of vinegar when it's mixed with water that makes it vinegary. This next one right here is an amino acid. And you might know that amino acids are the components of proteins. And so you put them together, you structure these things together in those chains, and they make proteins. This next one right here is glucose. And glucose, of course, is a sugar molecule, and sugar is being one of the fundamental food sources that we use. And there's a few other examples here. We don't have to get into all of them, but another one, personal favorite that I have right here is a nucleotide. So this complicated one over here is one little component, one little piece of your DNA. And what a complex looking molecule, but at the end of the day, that forms one of the little letters in your genetic code. And so life is built on carbon. And we're going to start right at the beginning. We're going to start with the simplest kinds of carbon-based molecules. And the simplest kind of carbon-based molecule is something called an alkane. And so you might think of an example, like I got an example here, like butane, propane, methane. And these are all things you've probably heard of these examples before. All of those have the same ending, which is ane. And so we know they are all alkanes. And organic molecules, we're going to have a separate naming system for organic compounds. And we'll see why that is as we go. But basically, it's because those organic molecules are going to behave maybe a little bit differently than the ionic compounds we saw before or some of the other covalent compounds. And so what we're going to do is every name is going to have a prefix and a suffix. So for example, butane is but plus ane. And so I know that it's an alkane because it ends in ane. And then I know how big of an alkane it is because of the prefix but. So basically the prefix is going to tell us the number of carbon atoms. So the number of carbon atoms is going to be told to us by the prefix. So for example, the prefix, if there's one carbon, we'll use the prefix meth, as in methane. And so methane is a one carbon chain. If I have two carbons in my chain, then that would be eth, as in ethane. And that may not be something that you've heard of before. But the next one, the next prefix is prop. And the example that would be propane. And so propane, of course, is what we have in tanks, and it powers our barbecues or whatever else. And so that is just a simple 3 carbon chain with hydrogens involved. The next prefix is but, as we saw. So that would make butane. And those first 4 are kind of strange. So it's this thing in chemistry where for some reason we give them these strange different names. After the number 4, it's going to fall back into more familiar territory. For example, number 5 is pent, which we saw when we did our covalent compounds. So that's going to make pentane. And then after 5 is 6, and 6 is hex. So that's going to make hexane. And then we get to hept, which makes, of course, heptane. And 8 is oct, which makes octane. And octane, of course, is, you may have heard of that as being a component of gasoline. So a major component of gasoline is octane. After oct is none, and that makes nonane. And then number 10 is deca, or dec, and that makes decane. Now, I know this is kind of just being thrown at you all of a sudden, but what I want you to recognize is that as we learn about more different kinds of organic compounds, we're going to keep the same prefixes. So you are going to have to know these prefixes, whether we're talking about really simple compounds or more complex ones, because we're going to keep on coming back to these for our naming. Okay. Now, again, I said that alkanes are the simplest possible hydrocarbon chain. And so what will they look like? Well, if I want to make butane, I can just look at my chart here and I see that butane, well, but means 4. So there's 4 carbons in my chain. So if I was going to draw this, I could have a carbon attached to a carbon, attached to a carbon, attached to a carbon, and that would make butane because there's 4 carbons all in a row, all in a chain. But of course, this can't be my full structure because carbon, we saw, always has to make 4 bonds because it's got those 4 valence electrons. So if every carbon has to have a total of 4 bonds, then what's filling this in is the hydrogen. That's the hydro part of the hydrocarbon. So I can add, for example, 3 hydrogens to this first carbon and then keep on filling in. Notice that this second carbon in the chain here, I only have to add 2 carbons to that because it's bonded to 2 hydrogens to that because it's bonded to 2 other carbons. And then the same thing with this right here. I'll need to add 2 hydrogens. And then the last carbon in the chain will have 3 hydrogens bonded to it. So I know I'm done when I've got my carbon chain and then it's all filled in with hydrogens. And that basically means that each carbon is forming 4 bonds. And as a reminder, hydrogen only needs to form 1 bond in order to have a full valence shell. So I could write this, that's a full structure that I've drawn out. I could write this as a condensed structure. So I could just write this as CH3, CH2, CH2, CH3. I could write it like that, and that kind of maybe is a little bit more simple to look at. I didn't have to draw out all of the individual hydrogens. But it turns out that chemists are even lazier than this. And so when they look at this, they think, well, there's got to be an easier way to write this. And they're going to use something called a skeletal structure. So a skeletal structure basically is our way of writing as little as possible. And the rules for a skeletal structure is you just draw lines. And every line that you draw is going to imagine that there's a carbon at each end of the line. So if I draw a single line, that would represent 2 carbons. But I have to do 4 carbons in a row. So what I do is every time I want to add a new line, I just make a little kink in the line. So this would represent 1, 2, 3 carbons. And since butane has 4, I need to add another little line here. And so you can imagine that this represents 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. I'm not going to draw the carbons. I'm actually not going to draw the hydrogens either, because you just know that it has to be all filled in with hydrogens. Okay, so that is it for hydrocarbons.